term limits is one of the pillars of the COS resolution, right? That we want to address at a convention of states. And let's talk about what does the COS resolution actually say that we want to address on term limits?
Sure, absolutely. Well, the three subject matter areas are proposing amendments that limit the size, scope, and jurisdiction of the federal government.
Right.
Discussing term limits for federal officials and restoring fiscal restraints. So the premise of discussing term limits is that it's pretty much agreed upon that Congress is not going to propose term limits on itself. They're not going to vote themselves out of a job.
This is a premise that we've put forth all along the way. This is why we're I want to stress this point. This is why we're one main basic reason why we're calling for a convention of states is because Congress is not going to do this, and term limits is the prime example. They're not going to address that. Go ahead.
No, absolutely. And Senator Ted Cruz introduces a term limits proposal in the Senate every single year, and you can just take the paper that's written on and start a fire with it because it's not going to go anywhere. I mean, nothing is going to happen, and it's just it would just be just like in my role in the private sector. I would just say, you know what, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to work here another 2 years, and then I'll just let somebody else have the job. I'm going to go home, or I'm going to do something else. And it's against human nature to do that.
Right. Yeah. But the basic that pillar in our resolution regarding term limits is for term limits to address not only Congress, but the judiciary and other federal officials. So it covers a much wider area than the Trump point. And I'm pretty sure, right, if I'm correct, the Trump under the Trump plan, the term limits was only to address for Congress, right?
That's correct. Congress only, and the whole premise is just if we're going to have this discussion, and that's all that second pillar says is to discuss term limits for federal officials. Let's just be able to have a meaningful discussion and debate in a constitutional environment about limiting the terms of service of Congress, political appointees, possibly judicial appointments. Let's just try to hash something out. Doesn't mean that something will be proposed or passed. I'm sure that something will be proposed, but it's just the only place where it's going to have a legitimate area of discussion is going to be in an Article 5 Convention of States meeting. It's not going to happen in Congress.
Right. Okay, this leads us now into your idea. Now, your idea doesn't really include a constitutional amendment. Am I right?
Well, it does. It takes I guess it moves the other two subject areas to a little bit more prominence, and then relegates the term limits to kind of a distant third of importance. It's still an important part of our resolution. And I think it's key to have that discussion, but I think effectively doing the other two, having proposals for the other two subject matter areas are really is of greater importance.
Okay, well let's get into your idea then, your concept, and tell us what you're proposing, what you're suggesting here.
Sure, absolutely, and the next. If you ask people, term limits are very popular with citizens and with people. Just like they see Mitch McConnell glitch out on behind the podium, or look at Nancy Pelosi or Chuck Schumer or Charles Grassley. Any of these people have been there for 20, 30, 40 years, and they're like, I'm kind of tired of looking at them. They're getting to the point where they're not functional. I mean, you even have have a representative from Texas, and her name escapes me here just right now, but she's been in a nursing home for 4 or 5 months. Nobody even knew about it. She hasn't even been in Congress.
Right.
And so, there's just no sense in them being there. So that's kind of, even though term limits are popular with the citizens, it's probably that gives us the greatest amount of pushback from elected officials, because a lot of those elected officials would like to have a political career, and they don't really like the idea of term limits. Missouri is a term limited state in the state legislature and also in the governor's mansion. And so, it's not really as popular. So as I've been volunteering with Convention of States since 2014, and actually this is my 11th year of actually going to the legislature and working with the legislature. After listening to their arguments and describing our proposal for so many years, I kind of thought maybe this is a different way to approach that. And it causes a little bit less heartburn with legislators. And so I guess you start off and just look that it's generally accepted that by most people that DC does too much and they spend too much and they stay there too long. They also agree that DC is not going to do anything to correct any of that. But I think I think they're incentivized to stay in DC because there's too much power that's concentrated, inside the Beltway. You have members of Congress that will making decisions that they have absolutely no constitutional authority to make. There are 17 enumerated powers in the Constitution, and those are 17 specific enumerated things that the Congress has the ability to has authority to do. None of it has to do with having a Department of Energy, a Department of Education, a Department of Natural Resources, an FDA. Those are all unconstitutional agencies, and so the result of this is they just really have more influence in our lives than what they're supposed to, and that gives them more power. Power is intoxicating, so they kind of want to stay in that environment. That's just human nature, and so they want to stay there and eventually blur the lines between what's actually good for their constituents and America, our country in total, and the bias goes a little bit more towards their own political aspirations and accumulation of power and wealth. And so as a result of making too many decisions and having too much influence in our lives, typically that comes with spending money. It takes money to fund these programs. And they'll start one program and they'll have unintended consequences, and then they'll start another program to correct those unintended consequences. And so, just like Ronald Reagan said, the closest thing to eternal life on earth is a government program. And that's exactly right. So in by spending this money, they have the ability to distribute funds, government funds, and pay people into basically supporting them, because, hey, I'm benefiting from this legislator's distribution of the government largesse my way, so I'm going to support them, even though I may not think that they're the best person for the job, or I think there's somebody else better that could run against them. And so that kind of insulates them. This power and the spending authority gets to insulate them. And this also helps serve special interests. Everyone has most everyone in Congress has a pet project or a specific area of passion, that there's a special interest that is associated with that. And these special interests, whether it be Chamber of Commerce, whether it be teachers unions, whether it be oil companies, whatever, or pharmaceutical companies, will contribute funds to their campaigns, bundle campaign contributions for them, and put on events and host events and give them a little bit more prominence and a little bit more notoriety, and that just further acts to insulate them from any type of a political challenge that might challenge their seat or might cause them to say, you know what, I think I've been here long enough, I'm going to go back home. Mm-hmm. And so really this power of incumbency ends up going into perpetuity, if they choose to do something like that. And so with so much power and control centered in DC, it really makes sense. It's really no accident that 7 of the top 10 wealthiest counties in America are within an hour's drive of Washington, D.C., an hour's drive of the Beltway, because that's the seat of government, and that's where the power is. That's where the money's spent. And so this really throws the incentive structure off, and it creates an environment that causes the federal government to grow and federal agencies to multiply, and that increases the amount of money that they need in the federal government in order to sustain those bureaucracies, and it continues to move government away from the people. And so, with term limits, this is why I think that addressing the other two subjects is really critical, and probably more critical than term limits. That if we decrease the amount of decisions that DC can make, and those political appointees and people in Congress can make, and we decrease the amount of money that they're able to spend, I think it would be interesting to see how that would realign the incentive structure to where they're not able to accumulate as much power because they're not making as many decisions. They're not handing out as much money to special interest groups and doing little pet projects here and there and supporting different constituencies. And the decentralization of the federal government, of which President Trump has also talked about in his 10-point plan, already moved the Bureau of Land Management and Department of Agriculture out of D.C.
That's the term I was beginning to think about here as you were going on, is decentralization, and that's
correct.
Moving the government, moving the control, moving the money out of Washington D.C. out into the states. So I see what you're saying there. Yes.
No, absolutely, and that is the goal of the Convention of States resolution, is to take that power that D.C. has taken from the states unconstitutionally and return it back to the state and local governments where it belongs.
Exactly.
And so if we don't successfully limit these decisions and limit the jurisdiction and limit the money that D.C. can spend, simply just sending new people up to work in a broken system is not going to work. And that's one thing that I've heard 1,000 times from legislators is, well, you know what? Well, we have term limits, and so you just send different people up, and then the lobbyists control everything, and all the lobbyists on K Street in Washington D.C., they control everything just like they would here at the state level. I'm like, okay, but that's the whole point. If we do this, if we address the other two areas effectively, then they don't have as many decisions to make. So now those lobbyists are going to have to lobby in 50 different state capitals instead of one national capital in Washington, D.C.
Right.
And to me, that decentralization of power is really how we can effectively rein in the federal government and actually get.
Plus, that
government can actually afford.
That power decentralizing, that power gets closer to we the people. So we the people have a greater influence, or have the ability to have greater influence on that power when it's back in the states. So, okay.
100%. So that's that's kind of my thought, that in the reason why, term limits is a very, very important part of our resolution, but I really think that effectively having amendments that address the other two subjects is really critical, and I think supersede the importance of term limits. And you mentioned President Trump's idea. President Trump's view of term limits, I believe you're correct that it focuses on Congress,
right?
And our resolution could apply this to the courts, to the whole judicial system, to political appointees, anything like that. I think it's interesting, without going into the weeds here too far. We see what's happening with President Trump and his implementation of his agenda here right now. That's largely been through executive order, pretty much, exclusively through executive order. And you see these federal judges that these different groups, unions, and other, special interest groups will forum shop and bring suit in a court with a favorable judge that's going to say, no, you can't decrease, you can't offer buyouts for federal government employees. You don't have the ability to do that, President Trump, or you have to put this rainbow jihad paraphernalia and visuals back up on federal government websites. So the judiciary has absolutely no oversight of the of the executive branch, of how the executive branch functions, unless they're breaking a law. And near as I can tell, President Trump is not breaking any law whatsoever. It's just, it's kind of like I saw a meme, and I think this just makes it great. It's like you own a business and your business gets robbed, and Elon Musk comes in and he looks at the surveillance cameras and he tells you, okay, this guy Bob is the one who held up your store. He's the one that robbed you. And then in response, you want Elon Musk thrown in jail. I mean, it just doesn't. I mean, it doesn't make any sense whatsoever. And so,
we're gonna have to kind of wrap it up here. So,
So I think that's one thing that we can propose through a convention of states meeting under our resolution, is we can limit the jurisdiction of the federal court system to where you don't have oversight of the executive branch. It's a separation of powers issue.
All right. Well, Brett, very good insight there. I hadn't thought about. You're basically saying the implementation of these other parts of our resolution will have an impact on the need for term limits. So I think that's a very good insight. Well, Brett,
I hope so.
Okay. Brett, just so everyone knows, Brett is a contributor for COS today. So we're going to ask Brett to report back to us on various other aspects of the administration and what's happening. So hope to be hearing from you again in the near future, Brett. So thank you very much.
I look forward to it. Thank you, Dale.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, I think Brett had a pretty good insight there.
Yeah, really interesting. And, he brought in some other points that I think, certainly are well worth spending more time on. Decentralization and some of the other areas that he talked about, I think certainly makes a lot of sense. I want to throw up, Dale, real quick, because I think it's interesting. One of our viewers, David Nally, said this: judicial review is a non-constitutional power invented by John Marshall and perpetuated by progressive judges.
Yeah.
Kind of an interesting comment. We appreciate that from David.
Yeah. Thank you, David. I think that decentralization, I think that's a really key to what Brett was talking about there. So
no doubt. When you start looking at, he started to get into the fact, the Elon Musk example, and a lot of these people who are ranting and raving about him not being elected, half these people that work underneath these congressmen and underneath, involved in these, they're not elected, and yet they're becoming more and more involved with perpetuating these different things that come up that they weren't elected for either. So
I think it's interesting that now they're tying the roots of Doge. The roots stem from Obama.
Yeah,
and I think that's a very interesting. He's the one that kind of first initiated and first suggested such a thing. Auditing systems and so forth. So,
yeah,
very, very, very interesting. I think what Brett's analogy of the having Elon Musk reviewing videotape to identify the robber of the business, and he identifies the robber, and then they want to have Elon Musk thrown in jail.
Musk in jail, yeah.
For identifying the robber. Oh my, it's unbelievable what happens. Well, sticking with the concept of term limits, another one of our contributors, a new one, David Punt out of Minnesota, is now doing a little series called Dave's Daily Dose. So I asked him to give us some thoughts on term limits, and I think he gave us a little bit here. Now let's play that. And Ken, before we get to that, would you like to maybe say a few words about that QR code?
Yeah, we'll stick in a little free advertisement for the QR code. If you got your smartphone out, this is very simple. It really is. I mean, you can. We love to have people like and subscribe to the YouTube channel and the Facebook pages. This QR code is different. It's really just kind of more of a support of COS Today. It's a separate platform. Doesn't cost anything. We don't email you every week. Matter of fact, we don't email you at all. Basically, we supply you with a platform that offers a lot of our contributors series, the full series. So you can go back and watch. I mean, if you're just joining us just recently, you can go back and look at some of these contributors' early contributions on video, as well as some other educational and other types of links that are supplied for you there, along with a platform of people that are again supporters of our cause here, and it's free. So we just invite you to take your smartphone out, put in your name, your email address, and we'll get you hooked up to the platform.
Okay, good deal. All right, let's listen to Dave's Daily Dose.
One of our gurus in the Convention of States movement suggested a couple of years back that the movement probably wouldn't get to do anything. Have a convention, suggest amendments to the Constitution, support ratification to 3/4 of the states. Rob Nadelson, I think, said it, and he didn't say it because the movement would run out of gas or everybody would get sick and die. He said that when it looked like the COS movement was getting somewhere, getting close, Congress would suggest their own amendments and, in essence, steal our thunder, maybe even on the same topic. And that's what happened last month. This is Dave's Daily Dose on Broken Road Radio. I'm David Allen Punt. The COS movement has convinced 19 state legislators to sign the resolution to form an Article 5 Convention of States. We need 34. We even know exactly what to do and have tried it. We had a couple of mock conventions, the last one last year. It works. We suggested amendments. We passed them through the committee. We got them ready for prime time to offer to state legislatures to approve or not approve. We were right there. And then Katie Britt and Ted Cruz, Republican senators from Alabama and Texas, suggested, reintroduced a resolution to impose term limit on folks elected to Congress. Hey. Oh, man. The Brett Cruz proposition would restrict senators to serving 2 6-year terms and representatives to serving 3 2-year terms. Ted and Katie introduced the bill in the last Congress, but it didn't get enough traction to pass. Meanwhile, the Convention of States effort includes term limits as one of the subject matters in our resolution. Note that when I describe subject matters in our resolution, I'm rather vague. Not so the Britt Cruz amendment, which is very specific. The idea behind vague subject matters is to restrict potential delegates to a convention of states to a limited number of topics, while not restricting creative ways they may come up with to finalize potential amendments. For example, lots of us would like to see term limits apply to bureaucrats in government and not just elected officials. There are even some who would like to see term limits apply to judges, some even to Supreme Court justices. We have limits on the office of president now. The 22nd Amendment was ratified in 1951 after FDR set new records on running for the top job and winning. There's talk of somehow letting President Trump get a third term because he's doing such a bang-up job so far. We'll see how that goes. And we'll see how the Brett Cruz Amendment goes in an institution jam-packed with senior citizens hanging on to their congressional limousines with every fingertip they can spare. I'm David Allen Punt.
You know, David is right. I've heard interviews with Mark Meckler, our CEO. I've heard interviews with him, and he's been asked the question, well, these things that COS is trying to get done by holding a convention of states, what if, do you think Congress might just go ahead and do these things anyway? And his answer has always been, well, that would be wonderful. But the thing is, they won't do this. These are things that they will not do. And that is so true. That is so true. That is that is a given in our minds, at least.
Yeah, I think anytime you look at power, it's in itself a very addicting drug, and they don't want to relinquish any power. And I think as we're finding out, and I think certainly we'll find out more as the onion is peeled back. But I think some of these politicians and bureaucrats are lining their pockets before they leave as well. So,
yeah. All right, Ken. Well, we're going to move from term limits. We're going to move to another segment here from Larry Hudson, another one of our contributors. Larry's the one that's been doing the series on Meet the Founders. And we've been stuck on George Washington here for some time. I don't know how much more he's got to go here. We're in the Revolutionary War stage here with George Washington, so I know there's going to be some more to go on George, but before he gets to another founder. But Larry just does a bang up job. He really does research. He reads a lot and does a lot of research. So I caught up with him a few days ago, and we recorded another session here. This is, for those of you that are following, this is episode 3, which is George Washington, part 3, segment 2. So I know those numbers don't mean a lot to a lot of people, but it helps us keep his segments organized here. So let's go with Larry Hudson on another segment here on George Washington. Meet the Founders. Well, welcome everyone. This is Dale Parrish, host of COS Today. We're back with another segment on Meet the Founders with Larry Hudson, and Larry's still working on George Washington. And this is episode 3, part 3, segment 2. We, as you'll see when I bring Larry on, we'll get to talking here, and we started in the last segment. We started with George Washington getting into the Revolutionary War. So Larry's going to pick that up with us and continue on with our next segment with George Washington. So without further ado, let me bring Larry on and we'll get started here. Hi, Larry.
Hello there, Dale. Good to see you.
Good to see you. We're back at it again here, Guy. Okay. And I mean, you told me when you started on George Washington that there was so much information out there that it's going to take us a while to get everything covered with him, isn't it?
Yeah, there's probably more written on George Washington than probably any other founder.
Yeah, and I know you're probably having to eliminate a lot of it, just
A lot of it.
yeah.
Yeah.
So anyway, it's been very, very good, Larry. Hats off to you, man. So let's
Well,
let's get going here. And of course, looking forward to what you have for us today with George Washington, Commander in Chief, Revolutionary War, and it looks like you got a really good outline here for today. And of course, I'll probably pop up with a few questions here and there.
Look forward to it.
Okay. So you want to get us started?
I sure will.
Take it away.
You bet. Well, before we do, I guess I want to let our listeners know we're headed into the Revolutionary War, and of course it lasted almost 8 years, 1775 to 1783, and of course Washington is in it right up to the very end. And during that period, there were over 230 skirmishes, battles, sieges that took place throughout the states from, New York all the way down to Georgia. And he obviously didn't participate personally in all of them,
Right.
but he was the commander in chief, and therefore he's responsible for their execution, either directly or indirectly. And most historians put Washington directly involved with approximately, I think, 16 battles or sieges. And I want to spend some time on, a half a dozen of the most important and the more well-known ones. But my intention is to try to focus on Washington and his decisions and actions in them, and not get into the weeds and scrutinize the battle plan or the scheme of maneuver and what actually went on in those battles. There'll be some of that, but I'm going to try to stay away from that because I know not everybody's interested in that, and so I don't want to bore anybody. So we're going to pick
information. Are those documented, Larry? The details about the battles?
Yeah, you can. It's probably easier to go online and just put in a battle's title and find it, or you can just ask for a list of the battles in the Revolutionary War, and they can all be listed for you. I've got a timeline of all of them that I like to refer to because I can't keep dates always at the ready,
right,
in my mind. But yeah, there's a lot of information apart from books. Britannica does one, the History Channel does one, Washington, Mount Vernon does one. There's a lot of information.
All right. Okay.
Well, we left off, after the siege of Boston, so that's
right.
That's where we're going to pick up now. He departed Boston, chasing the British.
Okay. Well, if I remember correctly, Washington pulled the recently formed Continental Army out of Boston. And after the British departed the city by sea without a real fight, and now he's headed to New York, right?
That's correct. That's correct. The British left Boston in March, I think it was, of 1776, and Washington guessed correctly, as it turned out, that they would target New York next. And so by mid-April, I think, he had marched his army of roughly 19,000 soldiers onto lower Manhattan. And he set about constructing 2 military forts. They'll become known as Fort Washington on Manhattan and Fort Lee, almost directly across the Hudson River in New Jersey. And these forts were to protect his force from being attacked by naval forces. Remember, Howe's brother Richard is an admiral, and he's got ships, so he's trying to protect his force from naval forces coming down the Hudson. And he remained certain that Howe was going to attack, General Howe was going to attack him on Manhattan. And in early July, the British did show up with approximately 400 ships, over 30,000 men.
Good Lord.
And this included a contingent of Hessian troops, and they arrived on Staten Island, which is threatening Long Island and not Manhattan.
Okay, now, wait a minute, Larry. You said Hessian troops were part of this British force? Aren't they're German mercenary troops fighting for money, right? Were they? Why were they called Hessians, and why did they fight for the British?
Okay, first of all, Great Britain they hired over 30,000 German soldiers during the war, and over half came from a region in Germany. I think it was called Hesse Kassel. And it was that name that actually, I guess, resulted in the German soldiers being labeled Hessians. I'm not sure why or how, but that's so that they're not all from that region. They were from other regions throughout Germany. Interestingly, I found Catherine of Russia had refused to supply troops to England, as did Frederick the Great of Prussia. But the Germans, who were ruled at that time by princes, decided to earn some money or make some money off of their troops. Now, the term mercenary is probably a bit misleading in that, in our modern sense, a mercenary, I think, implies for most of us a soldier that hires himself out, for money.
Right.
But these German soldiers weren't mercenaries in that sense. They had no choice. They were in established armies that were ruled, as I said, by German princes. And these princes had just decided to rent their services to England for large sums of money. They were just doing, what they were ordered to do. And the German nobility sold these soldiers at different prices. I found that the average was a bit over 4 shillings. I don't know what that was worth in those days yet. I haven't looked that up. But they got 4 shillings for each grenadier. And interestingly, that amount would be paid again whenever one of these soldiers was killed or when 3 were wounded. They got the same amount again. So it was a fairly lucrative thing for the Germans. And they served throughout the Revolution. They were both feared and actually admired for their discipline or ferocity and in particular, as you'll find or will find, their use of the bayonet. And they played important roles in numerous battles, but I think are most famous that we recall in our history for their service in the Northern Theater at White Plains, Fort Washington, Saratoga. Those are all in New York. And of course, the sieges of Yorktown and Charleston in Virginia. But they were also soundly defeated at the Battle of Trenton, which we'll see later.
Well, thinking back on the history that I know, that the Hessian troops were always, it seems to me, considered as really severe soldiers. I mean, really hard fighters, really outstanding soldiers, I guess. Anyway,
well, they were disciplined.
So they weren't really all Hessians per se, but and they were not soldiers for hire like we would normally think.
That's right.
But anyway, so let's get back to Washington and the Battle of New York.
Oh, okay. Well, I should have mentioned too that at this time, the Second Continental Congress had approved the Declaration of Independence on the 4th of July, which was just one day after the Brits landed their troops ashore on Staten Island. The start of what would become the largest expeditionary force in history prior to World War I. Washington had hoped that the Declaration would bolster his troops' morale and fighting spirit once they heard it. So he had it read aloud by the officers to all those in his command. And interestingly, I think when General Howe got ashore, he immediately sends a letter to Washington. And initially, this is kind of humorous, I think, General Washington refused to accept it. Why, you might ask? Well, it was addressed to Mr. Washington and not General Washington. A blatant breach of protocol in his mind. And it took 6 days of this letter going back and forth, at least twice, before he finally accepted it. But even after accepting it, he refused to open it. And after hearing what it said, he asked Howe's adjutant to basically relay the information to him verbally. And so after he had heard it, he's reported to have answered, those who have committed no fault want no pardon. So it was evidently an offer of a pardon.
Do we know what the letter actually said? Was it actually from General Howe concerning the upcoming battle there, or was it from the king offering terms for an end of the war?
Well,
you know,
yeah, we do. Howe indicated that the king, in this letter, the king had empowered him, along with his brother, the Admiral Howe that I mentioned earlier, to settle differences in America. And so Howe was hopeful that a meeting with Washington would be the first of many to work out these differences. And Washington, on the other hand, thought it was Howe was merely stalling for time, that he didn't have this authority. He just wanted to stall for time prior to an attacking him. So he refused the letter and the meeting and sent it back unopened.
Huh. Well, do we know if the king had really given Howe the authority to settle the dispute?
Yeah, but it's not entirely true, because we know that the king had rejected the idea. Conciliation or working out the differences was an indication of weakness on his part. And so apparently Admiral Howe, who was the naval officer, also served in Parliament for a period of time. And he had displayed, I guess, certain sympathies for the colonies by arguing for fair treatment of them at one period of time. And so when he was placed in joint overall command, he favored a policy of conciliation. And he insisted, and his brother, General Howe, as well did, that they needed the right to negotiate a peace with the rebels. Now, the final instructions in that letter, however, only authorized them, I think they were called special commissioners, to do little more than offer pardons. That's all they could do. They could not make a settlement or issue a settlement or negotiate a settlement.
Hmm. Okay, so where does this leave us now that you said Washington has refused their offer of a pardon? So where do we go from here?
Remember, Washington was convinced that Howe was just stalling and that he was ready to attack. And his victory back in Boston on Dorchester Heights had convinced him that his best bet was to get up on high ground. So while he was still convinced that they were going to attack Manhattan, he divided his troops, sending nearly a quarter of them across East River to establish a position on Long Island, on Brooklyn Heights in particular, which was terrain that commanded the southern tip of Manhattan. And so dividing his troops like this is going to prove costly, a big mistake, since Howe's initial attack comes on Long Island, not Manhattan. And Howe eventually gets around and behind the American troops on Brooklyn Heights, and he attacks them from the rear. And what follows is a rout. The British and the Hessians overwhelm the Patriot forces, both Continentals and militia. Heavy losses ensue, killed, wounded, tremendous numbers captured. Prisoners even included 2 general officers, Lee and Alexander, or Lord Stirling, as he was called. I'll talk more about those in a later episode. And the rebel army appeared to be doomed, trapped really with its back against the East River. And Washington could only look down on the scene. And he was said to have remarked, "Good God, what brave lads I must lose." And so Howe fortunately, had Howe continued the attack, many historians feel that he might have gained a great victory and ended the war right then and there. But fortunately, he halted the fighting and directed his men to dig in and await reinforcements. And seeing this opportunity, Washington then ordered his men to evacuate Long Island. They did it under the cover of darkness. It was really a strategic success, as they did it by boats, boat after boat after boat, getting all of his 9,000, at that point, 9,000 Continentals across the river to safety. And they did it just in time because they still had people out on the river, I guess, in boats, and dawn was about to break, and a fog that Washington talks about later, miraculously, I should say, not mysteriously, descended on the scene and prevented them from being discovered. And Washington, of course, was the last man to leave Brooklyn in one of those boats.
Really? So this appears to have been a defeat for Washington after somewhat of a victory in Boston, right?
Oh, yeah. The Battle of Long Island, or it's also known as the Battle of Brooklyn Heights, is considered his first defeat, where he's an actual commander on the ground in contact with the enemy. He lost over 1,500 men in the fighting on Long Island, and feelings really began to rise after that perhaps someone else was needed, someone with more tactical experience at the helm. And he and his officers even considered burning down New York City, abandoning it, burning it before they left to the ground after retreating from Long Island. Tories or loyalists, as they were called, they owned approximately 2/3 of the town, apparently, and feelings of hostility were rampant among his troops. However, he changed his mind after he had another one of those infamous councils of war with his officers, and they convinced him to abandon the city rather than burn it. But once again, he splits his already reduced, weakened forces and spreads them across Manhattan. And unfortunately, Howe attacks, this time with the support of his brother, 5 British warships on the East River, just offshore from what we call Kip's Bay today. Those warships began a naval bombardment that broke the troops, and he was faced with another rout. And the American center collapses, and Washington's trying desperately to halt the stampede, but he's unable to. He's furious. There was one account where they said he drew his sword and pistols, and he threatened the men who were fleeing past him. It was reported he even cursed at them. He even struck some of them with the flat of his sword as they ran past him. He's mounted on horseback, but it had no effect. His aides finally had to restrain him and grab him, take him to safety, but the damage, was done. Fortunately, again, for the American cause, Howe demonstrates a similar lack of aggressiveness that he did previously there on Long Island, and he halted his troops. And here again, many think that had he rapidly continued on toward the Hudson, he might have captured a large part of the remaining forces, the Continentals in particular, and it would have ended the resistance right then and there. So Washington suffers yet another defeat, this one called the Battle of Kip's Bay.
Wow, another defeat for Washington as commander-in-chief. Are things going to get better for him?
Well, yes and no. As you might suspect, it's going to be a seesaw fight for Washington. He's now back on Manhattan, waiting for the British to renew their attack. Howe finally makes a move by sending several thousand troops up the East River by boat, and this is going to be an amphibious landing that Howe attempts with Lord Cornwallis to trap Washington. And Washington sees this danger, quickly moves his army to higher ground in northern Manhattan near White Plains, and this proves to be untenable. And now a large Hessian force, along with British cavalry, strike his right flank. and another retreat begins in total disorder. So Washington retreats yet a third time northward, and Howe turns his attention to capturing forts Washington and Lee, which he ultimately does. And finally, Washington's shrinking army retreats this time across into New Jersey, across the Hudson, to regroup and rest. And the New York campaign turns out to be the lowest point in Washington's military career during the War for Independence. These two defeats, or three defeats actually, cut him to the quick, and his pride is devastated. He even contemplates resigning his command. Troops, or his officers, actually talk him out of it. There would be chaos if they tried to change command at the top at this point in time. And fortunately, he's going to regain his footing. He is able to finally launch a famous counterstroke or two against the British and German forces at Trenton, and then another one at Princeton, I should say.
Princeton. Okay, Larry. Well, we got to wrap it up there on this segment. So another very interesting segment on George Washington. So he really suffered some defeats here, didn't he? So
yeah, his first forays into battle are real disappointments.
Yeah,
he divides his forces, and something that he'll learn he shouldn't do.
Yeah. So we'll pick it up the next time there at Trenton and Princeton.
Trenton and Princeton are two battles. They're not large battles, but they, for some reason or other, they rouse the Patriots. We're going to hear a little bit about Payne, Thomas Payne. Thomas Payne, the writer, is also a soldier in Washington's army, and he writes his famous treatise that is famously quoted so often, and it just turns the colonies around. They are just infused, as well as Congress, and so it's a real turning point.
Good.
In particular.
Looking forward to it. Good job. Good job. Thank you, Larry.
You bet.
Have a good day.
Take care.
I'll tell you, Larry's just doing a bang-up job on this. I don't know. I hope that's not too long for our viewers. Maybe we ought to shorten those up a bit. But it's just very interesting. I tell you, I'm learning a lot. I don't know about our viewers.
Yeah, there's aspects of George Washington. I mean, everybody I think has a very I don't know the right word for it. They have the highlights, I guess, of George Washington, and these deeper details on how he fought battles and how he came in and out of this is very, very detailed and very interesting to know that this man who became our first president was he went through quite a bit.
Sure did. We don't hear in our history books, at least I didn't hear about the defeats and the size of the British force. 400 ships. My goodness.
Yeah.
Wow.
There's I guess as we look at history and certainly the time period we live in now, there aren't many men that come to mind. I mean, they're sprinkled throughout history, I guess, but there aren't many men that you think about. That I mean, even you just think about this past year that we had. Whether you're a supporter or not, or whether you like them, whether you don't like them, Trump certainly went through something I don't think most men would have stood up to.
Right. Yeah.
It was attacked from all different angles, and again, whether you agree with it or not, and we're certainly going to dive into more of the criminal aspects of it and what was legal, what was not legal, all that stuff gets mingled in. But certainly, they threw everything but the kitchen sink at him, and then I think the kitchen sink did finally come too. So.
That's for sure. Well, let's let's talk here about what's coming up next here, Ken. And we got the next broadcast coming up. So our roundtable, and that's coming up on the 24th, next Monday, and our topic's going to be education. So that ought to be education and the Trump education plan and what's happening with the Department of Education. I think it's specific, more so centered on the Department of Education and what's going to happen there.
Yeah.
So that's coming up next Monday, and then coming up the following Monday on March 3rd, Gary Harbaugh is going to give us a report on what is the Sovereign Wealth Fund. Have you heard of this, Ken? The Sovereign Wealth Fund.
I've heard the term. I don't know much about it.
Well, Gary's going to educate us on this. And of course, we'll have another Dave's Daily Dose and another COS Basics. So that's coming up on the 3rd. And once again, if anybody's got any questions or comments about our program tonight, drop us an email at raiseyourvoicecos@gmail.com. raiseyourvoicecos@gmail.com. So let's work our way now to closing out. I want to see. Let's take a look at another COS basics from our John Ackerman. Okay.
All righty.
I think this one's on servant leadership, if I remember right.
Okay.
John Ackerman for Convention of States, Indiana. This is the 3rd video in my series on COS basics. As I said at the outset, an organization's effectiveness is a direct result of its values. And so we are looking at Convention of States core values here in this series of videos. Core value number 1 was to preserve constitutional originalism. Number 2 was to foster responsible self-governance. And now I want to talk to you about number 3, cultivate servant leaders. Now, way back in the Bible, Jesus said that he came to earth not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many. Now, what is the definition of a servant leader? It's someone who shares power, puts the needs of coworkers ahead of his or her own needs, and helps people develop and perform to the highest level possible. Instead of the people working to serve the leader exists to serve the people. And in order to do that, a servant leader must listen to the people, find out what their needs are, find out what their hopes and dreams and aspirations and goals and objectives are. I'm going to quote a British prime minister from the 19th century. His name was Benjamin Disraeli. He was a conservative politician and a writer who was elected 2 times to serve as Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, and he played a central role in the creation of the modern Conservative Party in the United Kingdom. He helped to define its policies and its broad outreach. Benjamin Disraeli said, "I must follow the people. Am I not their leader?" Let that one sink in. I must follow the people. Am I not their leader? You see, servant leadership inspires employees and volunteers to serve others and to make a positive difference in their communities. Here in Convention of States, we promote these principles of servant leadership through training and mentorship opportunities. And let me close by saying this, that the highest calling of leadership is to unlock the potential of others. Core value number 3, cultivate servant leaders.
Well, you're muted, Dale. You've got something there to close with. You have to unmute yourself. That
Sorry about that, folks.
little button evades most of us all the time.
Yep, yep.
Yep.
Well, just a little reminder there across the bottom tickler of the upcoming broadcast that we have coming up on the 24th as well as March 3rd. So we're going to close out our broadcast this evening. Before we close out, Ken, any comments from our viewers that we need to address tonight? Or
Well, there was a number of comments off and on. David Todd wanted to know what happened to Marengo Mike. I told him we'd get there.
Yeah, he's coming up next.
And then there was a number of comments about obviously some of the things about George Washington. And I did want to put a last minute plug. I know we've almost forgot, Dale, that wanted to invite our Indiana viewers to join us this Wednesday between 9 and 3 down at the State House for our Surge Day.
That's right.
And let people know that if you are on, if you locate us on YouTube, we are going to be covering that live, at least of the morning session of that, where we'll have some senators speaking and some of our convention of state leaders, and possibly even a visit from our governor. We'll see, but I know that's a possibility. But just wanted to invite people, come on down and join us. I know it's going to be cold, but it'll be warm in the State House, and even warmer to get together with a bunch of convention of state leaders as we visit our State House to show our strength.
Yeah, I'm glad you remembered to mention that. That's true. That's coming up this Wednesday. So we're going to be there. Hope to see you, everyone. Always, this is a once a year type event that we do at the state capitol. So ought to be a good day. Ought to be a good day. Well, Ken, let's close out this evening's broadcast with a little piece from Marengo Mike. And when Marengo Mike is finished, then we'll officially sign off. So thank you, everyone, for signing in and viewing with us this evening. So hope to see you again. And once again, thank you very much for all your support. So, all right, Ken.
Good night.
Let me get to Marengo Mike here, and we'll get it going.
Marengo Mike here with a reminder that our work to raise the bar on making our federal government accountable to the people is only halfway done. We need to grow our grassroots army of citizens every day to fulfill the vision of our forefathers and keep our land free and prosperous. So, if you have never signed the petition to show your support, use that QR code and do that now. While you're there, why not kick it up a notch and volunteer for many of the positions available where your talents can make a difference as we march into a new year. Thank you, and God bless.